You are sitting across from someone you respect. The conversation starts casually, then drifts into religion almost by accident. At first, you repeat the answer you have always given because it comes naturally. Then the other person asks a question so simple that it feels almost unfair. Can the resurrection actually be proven? For a moment, everything becomes strangely quiet. You realize that you have spent years hearing people say that the resurrection is the foundation of Christianity, the greatest event in history, the reason millions believe. But when you hear the word proven, something changes. You suddenly notice that proving something is different from believing it. It is different from trusting it. It is different from finding it meaningful. You begin to wonder whether those words have quietly blended together in your mind without you ever noticing. This is where uncomfortable conversations usually begin, not because someone attacks your beliefs, but because someone asks you to define what you mean by certainty. Most people never stop to separate evidence from confidence because daily life rarely forces them to. We wake up assuming the floor will support us. We assume our friends mean what they say. We assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Human beings survive because we rely on countless assumptions, but religious claims occupy a different category. They often concern events that happened thousands of years ago, involving people we cannot interview, places we cannot revisit in their original state, and experiences that cannot be recreated in a laboratory. That does not automatically make those claims false. It simply means they belong to a different kind of conversation than proving the boiling point of water or measuring the speed of light. Yet many people feel uncomfortable admitting that distinction because they fear it weakens their position. In reality, refusing to distinguish between different kinds of evidence often creates more confusion than clarity. Imagine two siblings arguing over an old family story. Their grandmother always insisted that a particular photograph was taken on the happiest day of her life. One sibling believes her completely because she trusted their grandmother. The other asks whether there are letters, diaries, or witnesses confirming the memory. Neither response necessarily comes from dishonesty. One values testimony rooted in relationship. The other values independent confirmation. Neither approach is irrational on its own. They simply reflect different ways people evaluate claims. Something similar happens whenever the resurrection is discussed. Some people begin with the conviction that the accounts recorded in the New Testament deserve substantial historical trust. Others begin by asking how historians normally evaluate ancient reports, especially reports describing extraordinary events. The conversation quickly becomes less about one event and more about the standards we use to judge every historical claim. That realization alone unsettles many people because it exposes something we rarely admit. We often apply one standard to ideas we already accept, and another standard to ideas that challenge our worldview. Psychologists have spent decades studying confirmation bias, the tendency to notice evidence supporting our existing beliefs while unconsciously minimizing information that creates discomfort. This is not a flaw found only in religious people or only in skeptics. It is deeply human. A committed believer may immediately recognize every argument supporting the resurrection while dismissing every objection as motivated reasoning. A committed skeptic may instinctively search for every possible natural explanation while dismissing sincere testimony because miracles seem impossible before the evidence is even examined. Both reactions reveal something important. Human beings rarely approach emotionally significant questions as blank slates. Identity quietly shapes interpretation long before logic enters the room. Consider how people respond to news involving their favorite athlete, political leader, or celebrity. When accusations appear, supporters instinctively look for reasons the reports might be false. Critics instinctively assume the accusations must be true. The same evidence often produces completely different conclusions because the emotional investment existed first. Religious questions are no different. For many people, the resurrection is not simply one historical claim among thousands. It represents hope, purpose, forgiveness, identity, family tradition, community, and the possibility that death is not the end. Questioning it can feel like threatening an entire way of understanding reality. Others grew up feeling manipulated by religion. For them, questioning the resurrection may feel like reclaiming intellectual freedom. Neither emotional background automatically determines whether the resurrection happened, but it does influence how evidence is received. Honest reflection begins when we acknowledge that our emotions travel alongside our reasoning instead of pretending they remain outside the room. Historians who study the origins of Christianity generally distinguish between questions that history can investigate and questions that extend beyond historical method. Many agree that Jesus was a real historical figure, that he was executed by crucifixion under Roman authority, and that his followers soon proclaimed that he had been raised from the dead. Those points are supported by multiple ancient sources and are widely discussed across a broad range of scholarship. From there, however, interpretations diverge. Some scholars argue that the rapid growth of resurrection belief, the willingness of early followers to endure hardship, and the traditions preserved in early Christian writings deserve serious consideration when evaluating what those first witnesses claimed to experience. Others argue that sincere conviction does not necessarily establish the objective truth of a supernatural event. Throughout history, people from many cultures have sincerely reported visions, religious experiences, and encounters they interpreted as miraculous. Sincerity demonstrates that people believe what they say. It does not automatically demonstrate that every interpretation is historically correct. That distinction matters because people often confuse confidence with verification. Imagine someone standing outside after sunset, insisting they saw an unidentified object moving silently across the sky. They are completely sincere. They describe every detail with confidence. They pass a lie detector examination. None of those facts prove they intentionally deceived anyone. Yet investigators would still ask additional questions. Could atmospheric conditions have altered perception? Were there other witnesses? Are there photographs? Could there be an ordinary explanation? None of those questions insult the witness. They simply recognize that human perception is remarkably powerful and remarkably imperfect at the same time. Memory itself is not a flawless recording device. It reconstructs experiences rather than replaying them like a video file. This reality appears in everyday life. Families disagree about conversations they all attended. Friends remember the same vacation differently. Two honest people can describe one event in incompatible ways without either intending deception. Recognizing the limits of memory should encourage humility rather than cynicism. It reminds us that evaluating ancient testimony requires careful thought instead of immediate certainty. At this point, some people become frustrated because they want a simple answer. Either the resurrection is proven or it is disproven. Reality rarely cooperates with our desire for neat categories. Historical reasoning often deals in probabilities, cumulative evidence, competing explanations, and incomplete information. Ancient history does not usually offer mathematical certainty. Instead, historians weigh documents, cultural context, chronology, authorship, consistency, and plausibility. They compare explanations rather than proving events with the precision expected in modern experimental science. That does not make history meaningless. If it did, we could know almost nothing about the ancient world. It simply means historical knowledge operates differently from laboratory knowledge. Recognizing this difference does not weaken history. It clarifies what history can and cannot accomplish. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between events that are ordinary and events that are extraordinary. If someone claims they walked through a city yesterday, the evidence required is relatively modest because walking through cities happens constantly. If someone claims they returned from the dead after being publicly executed, the claim belongs to an entirely different category because such events are extraordinarily uncommon in ordinary human experience. Some philosophers therefore argue that extraordinary claims require correspondingly strong evidence. Others respond that if a genuinely unique event occurred, it would naturally appear extraordinary by definition. The disagreement is not merely about one historical report. It concerns how we evaluate uniqueness itself. This is why discussions about the resurrection often continue generation after generation without universal agreement. Participants are frequently operating with different assumptions about history, philosophy, and the possibility of miracles before they even examine the sources. That realization may be the most uncomfortable part of the conversation because it forces us to examine ourselves as carefully as we examine the evidence. Are we seeking understanding or merely confirmation? Are we willing to revise our assumptions if the evidence genuinely challenges them? Or have we already decided what conclusion we will accept regardless of what follows? Those questions are difficult because they expose something deeper than religious disagreement. They reveal the universal human struggle to balance identity, emotion, reason, and hope. Perhaps the most intellectually honest response is not pretending certainty where uncertainty remains, nor dismissing thoughtful arguments simply because they lead somewhere unexpected. Instead, it is recognizing that serious questions deserve serious reflection. That evidence should be weighed carefully, that belief and proof are related but distinct ideas, and that conversations about history become richer when we resist the temptation to replace curiosity with slogans. If this reflection challenged you to examine your assumptions more carefully, instead of defending them automatically, consider subscribing and returning for more conversations that value thoughtful questions as much as confident answers. There is another reason this conversation refuses to disappear. Deep down, it is not only about whether one event happened nearly 2,000 years ago, it is about the kind of universe we believe we live in. If reality is entirely governed by natural processes, then every historical report of a miracle will naturally invite skepticism because it appears to contradict everything we regularly observe. If, however, a person believes that a transcendent God exists and is capable of acting within history, then miracles are no longer impossible by definition. They may still be rare, they may still require careful examination, but they are not automatically excluded. This is why debates over the resurrection often begin long before anyone opens an ancient manuscript. They begin with assumptions about reality itself. Two intelligent people can examine the same collection of historical sources and arrive at different conclusions because they are asking different questions. One asks whether the documents provide sufficient historical evidence for extraordinary claims. The other asks whether extraordinary claims should ever be accepted without overwhelming evidence that rules out every ordinary explanation. Neither question is foolish. Both deserve to be taken seriously. Yet public debates often pretend the disagreement is much simpler than it really is. People speak as though one side possesses pure reason while the other survives entirely on emotion. Human beings are rarely that simple. We all carry emotional commitments into every important discussion. Think about how people react when a long-held family story turns out to be inaccurate. Nobody enjoys discovering that a cherished memory was incomplete or misunderstood. The emotional discomfort does not arise merely because a fact changed. It comes from realizing that part of your identity was quietly built upon that story. Religious beliefs often function in the same way. For some people, belief in the resurrection is connected to childhood memories, parents, grandparents, weddings, funerals, prayers during difficult nights, moments of forgiveness, and experiences they consider deeply personal. Asking whether the resurrection can be proven may therefore feel less like an academic exercise and more like asking whether those moments still carry the meaning they have always held. Others arrive at the same question from the opposite direction. Perhaps they experienced hypocrisy, manipulation, or disappointment within religious communities. For them, examining the resurrection becomes part of a broader effort to separate genuine history from ideas they believe were accepted without sufficient scrutiny. Once again, the emotional background differs, but the psychological mechanism remains remarkably similar. Human beings naturally protect the narratives that help them understand themselves. That does not mean those narratives are false. It simply means we should be aware of how strongly identity influences interpretation. This becomes especially important when discussing the earliest Christian sources. One frequently discussed point among historians is that the earliest followers of Jesus genuinely believed they had encountered the risen Christ. That claim itself is historically significant. Whether those experiences are interpreted as appearances of the resurrected Jesus, visionary experiences, religious encounters, or something else depends on broader philosophical and historical judgments. The important distinction is that historians can often investigate what people claimed, how quickly those claims spread, and how those claims affected subsequent events. Determining the ultimate cause behind those experiences is more difficult because historical methods cannot directly observe supernatural causes. This limitation is not unique to Christianity. Historians face similar challenges whenever ancient sources describe divine intervention, prophetic visions, or miraculous events across many cultures. They can analyze texts, compare traditions, evaluate dating, examine cultural context, and consider competing explanations. What they cannot do is reproduce unique historical events in controlled conditions. That reality frustrates people who expect history to function like experimental science. Yet history has always required careful reasoning from incomplete evidence. Consider famous events from antiquity that no serious historian doubts, even though no living witness remains. We know about rulers, battles, political decisions, and cultural movements because multiple forms of evidence converge. Documents, inscriptions, archaeology, coins, and independent sources gradually build a historical picture. Rarely does any single piece of evidence settle every question. Instead, historians ask which explanation best accounts for the available information while remaining open to revision if new evidence appears. That same approach influences discussions surrounding the resurrection. Some scholars argue that several historical facts are relatively well established, including Jesus' execution, the sincere belief of many early followers that he had experienced resurrection appearances, the rapid emergence of Christian communities, and the transformation of individuals who had previously been fearful after Jesus' death. From there, different explanations compete. One perspective concludes that the resurrection itself best explains these developments. Another proposes combinations of visionary experiences, grief-related phenomena, religious expectation, memory formation, legendary development, or other natural explanations. Each proposal attempts to account for the same historical observations while differing over their interpretation. This is why thoughtful disagreement continues among scholars with extensive expertise in ancient history. The existence of disagreement should not be mistaken for evidence that no progress has been made. It simply reminds us that complex historical questions rarely produce universal consensus. Something else deserves attention as well. People often imagine that certainty is the normal human condition, when in reality, much of life depends on reasonable trust rather than absolute proof. You trust friends because of accumulated experience, not because every possibility of betrayal has been eliminated. You choose careers, relationships, and places to live without possessing complete knowledge of the future. None of those decisions are irrational, simply because certainty remains unattainable. They involve weighing evidence, considering alternatives, acknowledging uncertainty, and making judgments. Religious belief often operates within that broader human pattern, although it concerns questions that many consider even more significant. This observation does not prove the resurrection. Neither does it disprove it. Instead, it invites a more realistic understanding of how human beings actually reach convictions. We rarely possess perfect information. We interpret incomplete evidence through the lens of experience, reason, community, and personal reflection. The danger appears when we mistake confidence for infallibility. History repeatedly demonstrates that intelligent people can defend incorrect conclusions with tremendous certainty. Confidence alone has never guaranteed truth. On the other hand, uncertainty does not automatically invalidate every conclusion. Refusing to decide until every imaginable question is answered may sound intellectually cautious, but it can also become its own form of avoidance. Eventually, every person must determine which explanations they find most persuasive, while recognizing the possibility that sincere and thoughtful people may disagree. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden beneath the question of whether the resurrection can be proven. It forces us to confront not only what we believe about one event, but also how we evaluate evidence, how we respond to uncertainty, and whether we possess enough intellectual humility to separate conviction from certainty. Those habits of mind extend far beyond religion. They shape how we understand politics, science, relationships, history, and even ourselves. Every generation inherits stories. Every generation questions some of them. Every generation also creates new assumptions that later generations will examine with equal scrutiny. The challenge is not to eliminate belief altogether, nor to accept every tradition without reflection. The challenge is learning to pursue truth honestly, even when that pursuit unsettles familiar conclusions. If that kind of thinking matters to you more than simply winning arguments, then stay with these conversations, because the most valuable discoveries often begin where comfortable certainty ends. Imagine that centuries from now, nearly everything about our own lives has disappeared. The buildings have changed. The technology has vanished. Most records have been lost. Only fragments remain. A handful of letters. A few biographies written decades after the events they describe. Some official records. A scattering of archaeological evidence. Future historians would not reconstruct our world with perfect confidence. They would compare sources, identify contradictions, weigh agreements, consider biases, and gradually build the most plausible picture possible. That is how ancient history works. It is not a courtroom with every witness still alive. It is not a laboratory where yesterday can be repeated. It is an ongoing effort to understand the past through incomplete evidence. The resurrection belongs within that reality. Anyone promising absolute historical proof is asking history to do something it was never designed to do. Yet anyone dismissing the discussion as meaningless because certainty is impossible misunderstands history just as much. Most of what we know about antiquity exists somewhere between blind certainty and complete skepticism. The real question is not whether every doubt can disappear. The real question is which explanation best accounts for the evidence we actually possess. That question has occupied historians, philosophers, theologians, and skeptics for generations because it refuses to disappear. Every attempt to settle it permanently runs into the same obstacle. Human beings are not only reasoning creatures. We are meaning-seeking creatures. We constantly search for stories that explain suffering, purpose, guilt, hope, and death. This is one reason the resurrection remains so emotionally powerful. If it happened, many believers see it as more than an isolated miracle. They see it as a declaration that death is not the final authority, that justice extends beyond history, and that hope is grounded in something larger than human imagination. If it did not happen, then one of history's most influential movements rests upon a mistaken interpretation of extraordinary experiences. Those possibilities carry enormous implications, which is precisely why emotions inevitably enter the conversation. But emotion alone cannot settle the question, neither can personal preference. Reality does not bend itself around what feels comforting. A claim is not true because it inspires millions, nor is it false because it challenges our expectations. That principle applies equally to religious belief and religious skepticism. Throughout history, countless ideas have attracted passionate followers before eventually collapsing under better evidence. At the same time, many true discoveries were initially dismissed because they conflicted with accepted assumptions. Popularity has never been a reliable measure of truth. Neither has ridicule. The uncomfortable lesson is that every person, regardless of worldview, must continually ask whether they are following evidence or simply protecting identity. That question reaches far beyond religion. It appears whenever someone refuses to admit a mistake, because too much pride has been invested in being right. It appears when families preserve stories that everyone quietly knows are exaggerated. It appears when political movements ignore facts that threaten their preferred narrative. It appears when friendships survive only because uncomfortable conversations are avoided. The human mind naturally seeks coherence. Once we build a worldview, we instinctively defend it, because changing our minds feels like dismantling part of ourselves. This is why intellectual humility is so difficult. Admitting uncertainty often feels like weakness, even though it may be one of the strongest habits a person can develop. Humility does not mean refusing to reach conclusions. It means recognizing the limits of our knowledge while remaining genuinely open to better arguments and better evidence. In the discussion surrounding the resurrection, this attitude transforms the conversation. Instead of asking how quickly we can defeat the other side, We begin asking whether we have fairly represented the strongest arguments on both sides. Instead of searching only for evidence that supports our existing position, we become willing to examine evidence that challenges it. Instead of treating disagreement as proof of bad faith, we recognize that intelligent and sincere people can evaluate the same historical material differently, because historical reasoning often involves judgment rather than mathematical demonstration. This does not eliminate disagreement, but it improves the quality of it. The question then changes from can the resurrection be proven beyond every conceivable doubt to what conclusions are justified by the available historical evidence, and where do philosophical assumptions and personal belief begin to play a larger role. That shift may seem subtle, but it changes everything. It encourages honesty instead of overconfidence. It allows history to remain history instead of forcing it to become something it cannot be. It also reminds us that faith and historical inquiry are related without being identical. For many believers, historical arguments contribute to faith but do not exhaust it. For many skeptics, historical uncertainty justifies withholding belief without necessarily claiming to have disproved the resurrection. Between those positions lies a wide landscape of thoughtful reflection rather than simplistic certainty. Perhaps the deepest challenge hidden within this entire discussion has nothing to do with ancient manuscripts or philosophical arguments. It is the willingness to examine ourselves with the same level of scrutiny that we apply to everyone else. We often notice confirmation bias in people who disagree with us while overlooking it in ourselves. We criticize others for protecting comforting beliefs while quietly doing the same thing. We accuse opponents of emotional reasoning while remaining blind to our own emotional investments. The search for truth becomes more honest when we recognize that every human mind is capable of self-deception. That realization should not lead to despair. It should lead to humility, patience, and a greater appreciation for careful thinking. Whether you ultimately conclude that the resurrection is the best explanation for the historical record, or whether you remain unconvinced by the available evidence, the process of asking difficult questions has value in itself. It teaches us that truth is rarely served by slogans, that confidence should never replace careful reasoning, and that meaningful conversations require the courage to admit what we know, what we do not know, and why we believe what we believe. The most important outcome may not be reaching identical conclusions. It may be learning how to pursue difficult questions without surrendering either intellectual honesty or respect for those who arrive somewhere different. Because in the end, the strongest worldview is not the one that fears questions. It is the one willing to face them without pretending that every answer is simpler than it really is. If these conversations help you think more carefully, question more honestly, and value evidence over assumptions while remaining open to complexity, consider subscribing and continuing the journey with a mind that is curious enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads.